They named the exercise Iron Vista because the Mojave gives everything a name that sounds like a dare. The battalion had rolled out before dawn, tracks hissing on hardpan, a low comet of dust hanging over the armored column. I sat behind the driver in a Bradley that smelled like canvas and oil. My headset settled into the soft bruises behind my ears that every soldier carries whether we look it or not. I was Staff Sergeant Miles Carter, S4 Logistics NCO, which meant I knew more about water than I ever wanted to, and I could tell you, at a glance, which pallet would be the first to get borrowed if we left it unattended for 5 minutes. I loved my job anyway. Logistics is how you tell the future and then make it come true. We were supposed to be out here to let the young lieutenants make mistakes where no one had to die for them. The brigade had split the desert into colored boxes. The OP-4 would chase us with fake missiles and real ingenuity. The mountains watched without comment. In the distance, the sky had the pink line you get when dawn is setting a table for a hot day. "Carter," came Captain Hale's voice in my ear, steady as a metronome. After the first halt, "check water discipline at Chalk 3. Tell Specialist Duran he doesn't outrun his bottles today." "Roger," I said. "I'll tell him a Mirage owes him money." "Don't promise him money," Hale said. "He'll start a line." The first wrong thing wasn't the heat, and it wasn't the dust devil that spun up and sat in the road like a spoiled child. It was the way the radios all at once caught a hiss that didn't belong to any equipment in our inventory. We get used to noise. We can tell the difference between static and the voice of a corporal trying to talk while eating. This hiss had shape. It rose, fell, braided itself through channels like a thin rope you could still break if you really wanted to. The driver eased off the throttle, and we became a caterpillar of armor holding its breath. "Net, this is 6, the battalion commander said. His voice, the voice you keep inside a clean drawer. "We're pausing to evaluate interference. Maintain interval. Maintain discipline. No one be the story," the sky answered with a bruise. It rose at the horizon where the mountains had been. It drifted toward us like smoke that had forgotten its fire. Someone made a joke about Hollywood opening a new ride out here. Someone else laughed because the other option was to get out and run, and the one thing you can't do in a crisis is run from your own training. The desert did not tilt. The vehicles did not jump. The bruise arrived and laid itself over us like a shawl, and the light went wrong, and then okay again. And my stomach fell the way it does when an elevator stops at a floor you didn't choose. The GPS dropped to zeros. The commo sergeant swore at a gentle volume that told me he respected the gods. The driver, who had fought in 2 countries and pretended to be 24 anyway, put his hand on the dash the way you put a hand on a horse when it snorts at a shadow. Then, we weren't in the Mojave. The desert still lay under us. The air was still dry, the way a clean sheet is dry. But the mountain line had changed. The horizon had learned a different grammar. The sun sat a hair too low for the time I knew it should be. And ahead, where our maps promised nothing but miles, an army sat down on the sand like a city at a picnic that had decided to bring its furniture. They were not a reenactment. The line glittered in sunlight, the light of polished bronze and hammered iron shields with bosses like fists, spears in ranks as disciplined as our own, banners that floated as if they thought they were birds. To the flanks ran chariots with spoked wheels and teams of desert beasts that were not horses but belonged in the same conversation. Behind, at a patient distance, something gray and massive shifted and snorted. Beasts like elephants but leaner, taller, their tusks cased in metal. "Net," the battalion commander said, and if fear touched his voice, it didn't settle there. "We are no longer in the box. We are making no sudden movements. Weapons on safe. No one engages without orders. If you need to pray, do it without using the net." Someone, maybe me, laughed once, like a hiccup. I leaned my helmet against the turret ring and watched through magnified glass. Their front rank had officers with crested helms. Their faces were real and sunburned and intent. They did not look astonished. They looked like men meeting an appointment they had talked themselves into keeping. The first thing we did that saved lives was ordinary. We drank a measured amount of water. We told our drivers to crack hatches a finger width so they could smell the world. The second thing we did was holy. We remembered that we were citizens of a country that insists the power of a weapon requires the restraint to not use it. The third thing we did was radio our brigade and got nothing, because there was no brigade to be found here. Captain Hale's Bradley drew up alongside mine. We passed a cable like a handshake. We looked at each other and didn't say any words like lost or trapped, because the words you use are the tools you hand your own mind. Sir, I said, careful. Water's at 60% green across the battalion. Ammo is live because OP4 wanted us to be spicy later. But we did not bring the full pantry because the Mojave is forgiving in ways this place may not be. Fuel is yellow if we're far from our bladders. Food is happy. Morale is a false positive, until people decide how much they want to talk. We're going to be polite, Hale said. The army opposite us made the first formal gesture. A rider detached, cloak pinned with a disc the color of sun, a spear angled across his saddle, to show he did not mean to throw it at anyone useful. He stopped at a distance that told me their archers were not a rumor. He shouted something that had Latin in it, if Latin had been raised by a desert and taught not to be fussy. Our interpreter was a sergeant from Texas who had taken 2 years at a state school and could spot a root when he heard one. He says we are to lay down our iron and surrender our spirits so their priests can help them find the way home, the sergeant said deadpan. He might also be recruiting. Tell him we are guests, Hale said. And we do not give gifts before we receive a welcome, the sergeant shouted back, and the rider frowned the way a major frowns when a second lieutenant says, with all due respect. He wheeled and rode back. A curt exchange traveled along the front rank like a wave. Shields lifted. The chariots drifted in like smart sharks. Net, the battalion commander said, we're going to be what we are. Task Force Steel Online. No one pulls a trigger until you can see their eyes, and then you still wait on me. Carter, make sure the world has water and that the world knows we have it. Yes, sir, I said. And then the desert moved. People think a clash is thunder. It is for the first seconds. Then it is work. The chariots came with a noise like loose cabinets. The front rank began to jog, shields tight enough that you could have thrown a blanket over them and made a decent shade. We did not shoot. We watched the distance shrink. The desert has ways of lying to you about distance. Our gunners knew how to listen to their own depth perception. Hold, the commander said. Hold. Let them see we are not frightened of being touched by their breath. Hold. I have been in fights worse than this. That's a sentence that sounds like bravado. It isn't. In another place, with mountains that held men like pockets, in another heat, with roads that had never intended to be roads, I had watched a convoy take fire from angles geometry ought to have declared illegal. That was worse. A steel chariot in daylight with a rider in good posture is not a worse thing than a roadside pile of trash that turns out to be a story with a fuse. I breathed, slow and quiet. Now, the commander said, and the kettles opened. The Abrams on our right spoke in voices that start too low to hear and end in a concussion that you feel in your teeth. The first round kissed sand in front of the chariots to remind everyone that warnings can carry handwriting. The second reached out and rearranged a harness so cleanly that, for a heartbeat, the animal pulling it thought it had gotten a promotion. The Bradleys braided machine gun fire in polite, measured bursts that wrote lines in the air and then erased them. We did not aim at faces. We read intent and we annotated it. The front rank halted as if someone had tugged on a string run through 100 belts. The chariot's handlers were not fools. They saw what happened when a wheel met a sabot round. They turned, collected themselves, talked in the grammar of men who had learned to be good followers and better cowards on the days when that was the job. The elephants, whatever they were called here, raised trunks and trumpeted a note that made my bones want to climb up into my skin. In the sudden stillness, a standard fell, and a man reached for it, and another man steadied him. It looked so human small, tender that I had to look down at my clipboard and pretend I was adding up water. We did not chase them. This is the part no one believes in our movies. The thing that makes us heavy is not the armor, it's the restraint. We held our line. We asked our gunners to breathe. We told our medics to prepare for what hearts do after they remember how hard they beat. A small group 5 riders, flags that did not dare to act like flags, came forward with empty hands. They stopped near enough that I could see the dust resting at the corner of one man's eye. He spoke to our interpreter in that rough Latin. He says, the sergeant translated, eyebrows up, that they would like to talk to the men who own the thunder. We'll send the ones who respect it, Hale said. Carter, bring water. Bring bandages. No weapons except the ones we wear because we are ourselves. We stepped out of our vehicles into heat that had been told to behave. The riders watched without a flinch as we approached. One of them had a crest of copper braided with hair. He introduced himself with a title that meant Iron Captain if you squinted. His eyes went across our faces as if he were making a map he would keep. "We didn't come here to brawl," Hale said. "We came here by mistake and are willing to leave the same way. But we do not lay down because someone tells us to lay down." The Iron Captain said something wry. The interpreter smiled despite himself. He says, "Only dogs lie on command. Men lie because they love their beds. We'd love beds." Hale offered a canteen. The Iron Captain did not take it. He gestured to the youngest among his men. The boy dismounted and took the canteen like it was a religious implement. He drank reverently, and his shoulders relaxed into the comprehension of cold water. He handed it back with a solemnity that made me want to check his knees for scrapes. They sent for their master. While we waited, we did the thing that proves we are not monsters. We asked for their wounded. We cleaned arrow cuts on our side and theirs. A medic taught a man with a scar how to press a dressing until the blood agreed to be a citizen again. War is terrible and ordinary both. The ordinary part is what keeps you human. Their master arrived with shade and dignity. He rode an animal like a dromedary and wore a robe the color of smoke at sunset. The Iron Captain dismounted and walked beside him, not quite touching his stirrup, which told me love and duty had gone to school together in this army. The master looked down at us with an expression I have seen on general officers who were young once and had not forgotten what that felt like. The interpreter took a breath and began to find the edges of words. The master listened, then spoke, slowly, and with the practice of a man who has made himself understood to tribes with no patience. He did not sneer. He did not flatter. He recited lineage his and his empire's, and then told us the part of the story that mattered. They called this place the Basin of Keshem. Their empire had lived along it so long their language wore grooves worn by centuries of the same songs. Periodically, the sky tore. People fell out. Sometimes they were demons, sometimes saints, sometimes poor lost things that wanted only to go home. Their empire had learned to be suspicious and gentle in varying measures. The last time the sky tore, their grandfathers died in numbers that made the priests build taller towers. "We have seen wars," he said at the end, and looked at us with a sort of pity. "You have seen skirmishes." The pity was familiar. It made my jaw want to lock and my hands relax. I thought of those roads that had never intended to be roads, those mountains the color of broken teeth. I thought of the quiet after a blast, the dust telling you stories about lungs. I thought, you have your ghosts, I have mine. This is not a competition anyone can win. "We're not here to challenge your history," Hale said, voice level. "We're here to keep ours from getting us killed before lunch." They made a corridor for us through their ranks. We moved at the speed of diplomacy, slower than the heat, faster than rumor. Behind us, our battalion held its line. Artie parked, eyes outward, guns cool. I left Sergeant Allen with the Class 1 and told him if any kid with his ribs showing showed up, you feed him until he looks like his mother will smile when she sees him. He said yes in the tone that meant he already had a plan. The city at the heart of the basin grew out of the sand like something that had taught the desert to be patient. The walls had been repaired and repaired again. Each mend was a love letter. Inside, the streets were shaded by cloth strung like the sails of ships. Water ran in channels meant for it. People had the look of a population that has learned not to gawp. They saw us. They hid their smiles and their fear, and went on with their work. We were given a house that had a central court and a mulberry tree, and 2 very old cats who resented our boots. Our radios liked the sky less each hour. We set up a line of sight micronet like a string of tin cans across roofs. We put a water point near the door and watched who came to drink. We set out tourniquets and Tylenol and a blood pressure cuff, and let the city show us where it hurt. The first fight came at night, as they prefer in this place because the day belongs to the sun, and the night to men who owe it money. A faction from the west, a tribe with tattoos that looked like arguments, tried to test our line at the gate, not because they thought we were weak, but because they thought the city had gotten soft taking us in. We didn't overreact. We lit the gate area with flares that made everything look like a photograph taken in the 60s. We put one machine gun on a tripod and stitched a polite message into the dirt between their feet. We did not chase them when they melted back into alleys. We did not put a boot where a boot would do nothing but bruise the air. The city watched. You could feel it. The way you feel a dog considering you. Do you know the rules? Will you abide by them? Will you be tedious about it? When dawn came, the old women swept the alley dust into careful piles and did not look at us. Someone left a basket of bread at our door that tasted like a patient grandmother. This is how you tell a place that you might belong. We learned their words for water and for permit and for line and for patience. They learned ours for stop and stay and good. We showed them the part of first aid that turns a neighbor into a miracle. They showed us how to cover our trucks with woven screens that kept the sun from punishing metal and the eye from being offended by our angles. They took us to a cistern cut into rock where the air smelled like old stone and new hope. A boy traced the route of the underground channel with his finger on the dust, while I nodded as if he were briefing a general. The empire gathered itself in a measured way. We saw scribes with wax tablets and soldiers with the posture of men who have played at parade so often the game has rearranged their bones. We saw beasts in bronze faceplates that turned their heads into something like a god's. We saw engines on the wall that threw stones with a hiss and a thump, and we saw, eventually, the reason they had answered us with an army and not a delegation. Far on the eastern rim, the sky was doing work. A wall of dust lived there, not moving, breeding thunder in its belly with no partner to be seen. It is his wall, the Iron Captain said, as if speaking of a person and not a weather. The Red Sovereign. He wants to teach you to kneel. The Red Sovereign turned out to be a man who wore a title that said more about his imagination than his resume. He spoke through drums. He sent waves of men to test the gate every 2 nights. He liked to sacrifice a goat and call it victory. He declared the basin his by right of having drawn a circle around a map and hit it with a stick. He was not new. We have men like him at home. They always buy the biggest hat first. Sir, I told Hale, he's going to escalate until he gets a slap he can't explain away. He thinks we are a show. He thinks a show can be cancelled. We are a supply chain. We are habit. We are worse than weather when you are trying to make a mess. You make poetry when you're short on sleep, Hale said. Let's build something he can't chew. We built a wall inside their wall, not stone habit. We set watch schedules that made sense. We layered fields of fire without touching a single tile, not ours to touch. We put a water tank near the gate that served as a village square, so our place made sense to them and theirs to us. We put a medic in a chair in the mornings where women could bring questions without inviting gossip. We ran fiber like a rumor through alleys. We taught 2 smart teenagers to be interpreters and paid them in batteries and the kind of respect that makes grandmothers brag. The Red Sovereign sent his first proper army at noon, because pride makes you do dumb things in daylight. We let them march until they were tired enough to understand that glory weighs more than it looks. We dropped smoke to break their neat lines without breaking their spines. We demonstrated fire in short, controlled dollops that gave their officers time to reconsider their choices. When one of their beasts in bronze decided to be brave and charge, an Abrams kissed the sand in front of it with a round that turned a philosophy lecture into a nursery rhyme. The beast stopped, blinked, and backed away with a dignity that made a corporal next to me say, "Same, buddy. We made enemies that day, but we made something else too." A priest in a white shawl came to our water point and washed his hands the way we did, and then he prayed. And then he taught 3 boys the names of our parts. He told us, in patient fragments, the story of the last time the sky tore. He spoke of a rain of fire that lasted a day and an ash that poisoned goats for a season, and men who wrapped their heads in cloth and brought a sickness that made elders into children before it took them. They learned mercy too late, he said, and did not look away when he said it. We weren't going to be those men. We made a clinic big enough for pride and shame both to fit through the doors. We set rules that made sense and explained them twice as many times as we had patience for. We carried our guns like responsibilities, not like hobbies. We wrote down who we fed and who fed us. We stacked pallets so neatly the city began to trust the shape of us. The Red Sovereign sent a messenger with a challenge written on a piece of tanned skin with a dye that looked like blood. He demanded single combat with our champion. We sent back bread and a note that said, "Our gods require us to win with spreadsheets." He misread the joke and sent drums to say he was furious. Good. Fury is a fuel that burns too fast. The siege settled into the rhythm of people. That is when wars are won. Not on the days a trumpet blares, but on the days you empty the trash and remember to be kind to a private who has forgotten what sleep feels like. We found the Red Sovereign's supply lines with small drones that looked like birds. We did not burn them. We pinched them. We shifted the price of food in his camp until he had to choose between feeding soldiers and feeding pride. He chose pride. Pride eats and never learns to cook. The night before his last push, the air trembled the way it does before a seiche on a lake. Our radios coughed and then settled. The sky over the eastern rim made a light like a struck flint. The old priest came to sit in our court and put his hands on his knees and say nothing. He looked like a man waiting for the moment when an old scar stops hurting and begins to itch. The Red Sovereign came with everything that could move, including engines I had not yet seen, wooden towers stuffed with men, moved by beasts in harness, and at their hearts, something that sounded wrong, a hum, low and growing, like a generator with a grudge. The towers threw ropes like tongues. The men on top shouted and raised things the size of children that glowed faintly, as if they had learned a trick from the sky. The air near the towers smelled like winter lightning. "Sir," I said softly, "they've found a way to scrape the seam and keep a spark in a box." Hale nodded once, the nod that says yes to reality. "We're not going to shoot the boxes. We're going to make them useless without turning this city into example number 2. We didn't light them up. We lit around them. We used everything we had that made the air complicated: smoke, heat, sound. We set our engines to a rhythm that turned their hum into chorus, and then failure. The towers kept coming because momentum is its own idiot. The first reached the wall, and the ropes caught on stone, and 100 men pulled, and the wall held because it had been held by hands for centuries before this day. The second found a patch of churned sand and learned that an army on the move and a dream of being taller do not always negotiate well. It tipped. It sighed. It laid down like a dog, deciding it had made its point. One of the boxes cracked. The hum screamed. The air around it tore in a line you could see like heat over a grill. I thought of the priest's story about ashen goats. I thought of a convoy in a different desert, and the way the dust tasted like pennies. I did not want that for these children. I ran with a spool of cable. You do not stop to write a risk assessment when the sky develops bad manners at waist height. 2 soldiers fell in beside me without being asked, because people are better than anyone expects. We sank rods into the ground where the sand had the sense to take them. We grounded the box. The hum climbed a little and then, like a tantruming baby deciding sleep is better than homicide, fell away. The crack in the air healed the way a breath does when it stops stuttering. We didn't win by killing. We won by being boring in the face of a show. The Red Sovereign didn't understand it. He had brought his generals to the front to see the spectacle. He had promised them a story to tell their heirs. Instead, we rearranged the price of his pride and handed him a ledger he couldn't balance. His men began to leave in 2s, in 3s, in 10s. Soldiers know when a commander loves his hat more than their mother's worries. At dawn, the Red Sovereign sent another messenger. This one brought no challenge. He brought a request for terms. His camp wanted to leave with its drums and its names. He wanted us to call him by his title twice in the document. He wanted, absurdly, a goat. We gave him the goat. We wrote his title once. We stamped the clay with a seal that bore the emblem of a mulberry leaf because it was near our door, and because the city had decided we belonged near mulberries. When they left, they did not look back. The city did. Banners hung from windows that had never before cared for our colors. The old priest came to our court and set down a bowl of dates and then, as if embarrassed to ask a favor, asked if we would leave some of our habits behind when we went. He meant the way we marked a schedule on a wall, and the way we taught children to wash their hands, and the way we stacked pallets with labels that made sense to tired eyes. "We might not be able to take you home," Hale told him. "We can leave you with our boredom." "Your boredom saved us," the priest said, and laughed like a creek discovering a better bed. The twist, the thing that changed the shape of my brain, arrived 2 days after the siege ended. The Iron Captain came to our house with a man in robes dark as spilled ink. The man bowed to the mulberry because courtesy is not always about the highest person in the room. He opened a box wrapped in cloth, and inside was a piece of metal corroded and lovely, a dog tag. The name was gone to time. The numbers were almost legible. The hole had been worn bigger by a cord that had once heated a human chest. Came from the eastern rim, the Iron Captain said, as if apologizing. The Red Sovereign's father found a field of bones there once. We followed him out to the rim. It took a day and a night to get there, across country that had been taught to be quiet. The place waited for us with the patience of someone who has told the same story for centuries. The ground had a stain to it, ash wedded to sand. In the center of a shallow basin lay things that were not of this world and were ours anyway. The half-skeleton of a wing we would have called fixed, and they would have called dragon. A hatch like a good door, the remains of cans that had once held food with names clipped into one syllable, and in the ash, scattered like stars on a bad night, more tags. There had been a crash here, once, of something so terrible and quick that the Empire had called it a god, and been half right. We did not build a shrine. We are practical in our grief. We collected what we could carry. We logged what we could not. We buried some things we did not want scavenged by boys with ideas. We told the priest the names of the saints we know: Courseman, Crew Chief, Gunner. We sat with the Iron Captain and did not lie when he asked us how hard the wars at home are. That bad, Hale said, and looked at the horizon like it had a question only he could hear. And sometimes worse. The thing we learned is that being clever isn't enough. You have to be kind when you can, and organized even when you can't. That's the part that scares men like your Red Sovereign. Not our guns. Our patience. When we came back to the city, it felt smaller in a way that was good. The mulberry had gone from green to a little less green. The cats had accepted that we couldn't be trained and had decided to pity us. The old women swept the dust into piles with less suspicion. The boys guarding our water point had begun to lean the way all teenagers lean when they think they're older than a minute ago. The sky had not forgotten what it had done to us. The bruise came some afternoons, a reminder and a promise both. Our Camo chief found a place on a roof where, at certain hours, the radios could catch a familiar thread. We heard static that tasted like home. We sent a message into it as carefully as we sent water into a kid with sunken eyes. We said where we were and what we had done. We asked for instructions, and then, because instruction is a thing you take as well as receive, we provided some. We could have gone home the first time the sky offered. We didn't. We stayed through a season because leaving right then would have taught the wrong lesson, that help is a kind of weather and not a habit. We trained a dozen teenagers to run a supply point. We wrote a little book in their language about stacking and labeling and first in, first out, and how to test a tank of water with your tongue and a clean conscience. We helped the priest teach hand-washing as a festival. We watched the Iron Captain rethink the weight of his crest. We taught the beast handlers to knock on a tank with their knuckles and hear whether it wanted repair. When we finally took the road to the rim on a morning when the bruise looked like an open eye, the city walked with us as far as the East Gate. They didn't make a show. They aren't that kind of people. Casual nobility is a better thread to wear. The priest put his palm on the Bradley's flank and said a blessing that did not ask for favors, only patience. The Iron Captain said nothing, and sent us away with a bowl of dates and a goat, which we insisted on naming, and then argued gently about who would get custody. As we lined up at the edge of the basin, the air went thin in the throat, the way an emotion does when it is deciding whether to be laughter or tears. The bruise bloomed. Our gunners checked their safeties as if politeness would be judged up there too. Hale spoke into the net in that drawer-clean voice. "Task Force," he said, "we have done good work. We have done it by doing boring things in a brave way. If the sky decides it loves us again and keeps us, we will build another water point. If it lets us go, we will remember to stack pallets the same way at home. That's the point. That's always the point." The light went wrong and then right, and the Mojave accepted us, dusty and patient. The GPS blinked, offended we had been disloyal. The net filled with voices that meant home. We parked where we were told to park. We took a breath and took another. Some people cried. Some laughed. I put my hand on the Bradley like a man thanking a horse. A week later, in a room with bad coffee that tried anyway, I was asked to explain what had happened. I said the words I could and a few I couldn't. I brought the dog tags and the little book we had written, and a brass token the Iron Captain had slipped me without a speech. I said, "We were underestimated, and so were they. We won because we have seen worse and learned better. We won because we put a water tank where it made sense to a grandmother. We won because we remembered that mercy is harder to learn than murder and more useful once you have it." At night, sometimes, in quarters that finally cooled down to something like fair, I could feel the bruise in the sky like a hand on a door that knows the house well. I would lie on my bunk and count the slow tick of the wall clock and think of the mulberry, the cats, the boys leaning like reeds. I would think of the Red Sovereign's hat and be grateful he kept it and left without asking us to admire it again. We named the operation something bureaucratic, as we do. The young lieutenants printed T-shirts with a goat on them because, of course, they did. The old priest's little book of stacking and labeling made its way back to the basin of Keshem, rolled inside a parcel of medical supplies we sent through a seam that had learned, at last, to behave like a road and not a trick. The Iron Captain wrote a letter that said the city had started sweeping a little earlier in the day and people liked it, and he had not yet died of boredom. People think our power is fire and steel. It is. But it is also the things we do when no one is filming. The way we drink water on schedule. The way we refuse to be hurried into foolishness. The way we put a goat on a T-shirt and mean it as a way of forgiving ourselves for not being as grand as the stories we tell. We are not special because we have seen worse wars. We are special because we decided, after seeing them, not to love war more than we love each other. In a basin in a world that will never appear on our maps, a boy is tapping a tank with his knuckles, listening for hollowness, and then smiling when the sound tells him the world has what it needs for one more day. If that is all we brought them, it is enough. If it is the beginning of more, then the bruise in the sky did not make a mistake when it found us.